work that has done more than any other to turn children and adults alike onto the joys of classical music. And that's Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Now, if you are of a certain vintage, then it is highly likely that you were shown a film of this work in school, presented by the inimitable conductor Malcolm Sargent, telling you all about the instruments of the orchestra as they played section by section.
The sounds in an orchestra are produced in three different ways, by the musicians either blowing, scraping, or banging.
But it is so much more than an instruction manual for children.
It's so accessible, it's so immediately involving. And I always felt that it was Benjamin Britten at his absolute best.
It ought really to be every person's guide to the orchestra, because that's what it is. It doesn't matter what age you are. I mean, it's just so good.
He writes a supremely confident piece of music, and a lot of his music elsewhere is about disquiet and difficulty, and this piece isn't.
It's about the fascination of music, and I think with this piece, he succeeded really well to communicate this fascination.
The score has become a classic in the concert hall and is still performed to children and adults alike around the world. So here in Hoddinott Hall in Cardiff, the BBC National Orchestra of Wales are going to perform the piece and explain why it's so fantastic. This is Discovering Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Britten is one of the 20th century's greatest composers. Setting out to educate children about the various sections and instruments of the orchestra, he ended up writing one of this country's best-loved works. Structured in three parts, the music begins in stirring fashion, with a theme taken from the great English composer Henry Purcell, written 250 years earlier. Britten then takes the orchestra apart, allowing each instrument its own variation on the Purcell theme. The 13 variations get to the essence of each instrument's characteristics in an incredibly colourful way, really showing every one at its best. Finally, he brings the orchestra back together in a display of compositional skill. The instruments joining one by one and repeating a number of themes, whirling together in what's known as a fugue. Moritz Gnann is the guest conductor working with the BBC National Orchestra of Wales.
I heard it as a kid, and I very well remember how it felt. To me, it felt like going to visit a palace. Like you know you're going to spend some time there, so you see this beautiful building, but you don't really know what's in there. It feels like Benjamin Britten comes out of the door and he takes me into this palace and guides me around and shows me all the different rooms and the architecture and the furniture and the ornaments, and shows me the garden with little birds and fountains and trees. And then in the end, when I look at the whole thing again, I feel very grateful for all that beauty that I've actually discovered in detail.
Britten's memorable theme was taken from Henry Purcell, a composer he greatly admired and whose popularity he would help to restore. He builds a bombastic, sprawling score from just a brief extract of Purcell's music, the rondo composed for the play Abdelaza in 1695.
Like most people from my generation, I was introduced to Young Person's Guide when I was at school. I heard it, I loved it. And many years later, I thought, ooh, I'll track down the Purcell theme that it's drawn on. And I listened to it and went, oh, that's rather nice. And what Britten does with it is takes it into realms completely unexpected and completely surprising.
So I'm going to turn to you, Nick, to find out a bit more about what we've just heard and how that differs from the piece that came 250 years later.
Well, you've got a massive change of style for a start. I mean, we're talking Baroque music and pretty much 20th century. And also you've got a massive change in the instrument, the actual physical instruments themselves. The stringed instruments are very, very different in Purcell's time. And Britten had the modern instruments we play now. So, I mean, you can hear it in the range of the instrument is very, very small in this piece that we've played, the Purcell. But in Britten, it goes all over the place.
This feels, I mean, obviously immediately recognisable, but it feels so much more restrained, doesn't it?
Again, I think it's a stylistic thing. I mean, the tempo that we play the Purcell is significantly faster and is much more akin to a dance than the Britten, which is much more of a statement of fact. And at the end, it comes back as a sort of real fanfare of joy, doesn't it?
It's an emotional kind of wave of music which comes at you with this piece. It's so fabulous, so varied. But why do you think Benjamin Britten chose a theme by Purcell? Why was that such a smart choice?
Indeed, this music is overwhelming. So I would love to ask Britten why he chose this piece. Unfortunately, I can't. If I was Britten, I would choose this piece by Henry Purcell, one of the most famous English composers. Well, he lived in the 17th century, and Britten much later, so he builds this bridge. And the theme is, for two reasons, great for this composition, because firstly, it's gorgeous, I think, it's just really beautiful. And secondly, it's very simple. And actually, the main theme consists of two elements that Britten uses to form those colorful variations later. We're going to show you those two elements. The first element is a very simple triad. Very simple, isn't it? And the second element is a scale, which goes up and goes down. So that's all we need. That's all what Britten, you know, a genius composer, needs to create a wonderful 18-minute piece.
Born in Lowestoft in 1913 to a dentist and a keen amateur singer, Britten was a prolific composer from a very young age.
I've got a list somewhere which says in great detail all the works that I wrote until about the age of 13, and it included something like 12 piano sonatas, 4 or 5 string quartets, dozens of songs, 2 enormous symphonies, a tone poem called Chaos and Cosmos. In fact, I was more interested in writing it down than even what it sounded like.
Britten's musical abilities were encouraged by his teacher, the composer Frank Bridge, and he began to enjoy early success with works like The Simple Symphony, A Boy Was Born, and variations on a theme of Frank Bridge. But his budding reputation would take a hit during World War II. Gay and a pacifist in an increasingly bellicose England, Britten and his partner, Peter Pears, left for America in 1939, just as it seemed Europe may be lost to fascism.
I think when he went to America, he was in a certain amount of confusion. He'd actually been sharing the mill at Snape with my father for 2 years. And certainly there was a slight feeling, well, deserting Britain in its hour of need was not a wonderful thing to do. But my father always told me that Ben, in fact, volunteered for the Merchant Navy, which at that time was just about the most suicidal thing you could do because all the convoys were being torpedoed. So I don't think he was a coward at all. But I think it must have raised in his mind a certain amount of consternation And in a way, a lot of Britain's finest music comes out of this sort of strange guilt about his homosexuality, which we have to remember today was illegal in those days.
After just a few years, Britten began to yearn for his homeland and returned in 1942 to continue work on the opera that would make his name. Peter Grimes, seen here in a later full-colour BBC television production, tells the story of an outsider fisherman turned upon by his coastal community.
In many ways, Peter Grimes, broke the mould. I mean, it was the first great opera since Purcell. It put British music back on the map.
As the country emerged victorious from the Second World War in 1945, Peter Grimes opened to a rapturous reception to an audience optimistic for the future, an optimism imbued in his next work, The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra.
I don't think you can ignore the period in which any novel or piece of music is written. The fact that this is written around 1945, 1946, I don't think is coincidental. I think there is a confidence about the piece and an almost heroic sound to it, that really strident, rich brass writing. He writes a supremely confident piece of music, and a lot of his music elsewhere is about disquiet and difficulty, and this piece isn't.
Commissioned by Basil Wright, who was supervising producer of the Crown Film Unit and responsible for producing information films during the war, Britten was tasked with writing a piece for a film which would educate children about the orchestra. He completed his score on New Year's Eve 1945 at the age of 32. And Instruments of the Orchestra was released the following year, featuring the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Malcolm Sargent.
Many of you may have heard and seen a full symphony orchestra playing in the concert hall. Many more of you must have heard one over the radio. But today, I want to take this great musical box to pieces.
Ben would have probably thought, well, this is a new medium, I'm prepared to try it out. But, of course, what he did was write a piece that works without it. He writes a piece which sounds like a masterpiece in the concert hall.
Now, of the blowing instruments, some are made of wood and are called the woodwind.
The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra has proven itself incredibly useful to visual introductions to the orchestra through the decades. From the film it was composed for, to the BBC using cutting-edge 80s graphics to illustrate the various orchestral sections. Today, there's even an online app featuring games for children based on Britten's music. It still feels as fresh and instructive tool as it did 70 years ago. Once the theme has been stated by all the sections of the orchestra, the piece moves on to the 13 variations. It goes so far away from those original simple themes, doesn't it? Because we go through music which sounds almost Spanish, we've got music which sounds as if it could be Stravinsky, to almost sort of jazzy martial music, military band music. I mean, the guy was almost showing off, wasn't he?
Indeed, he goes through all the styles. Sometimes it's very hard to recognize actually where is the theme. But I would like to highlight one variation, which is the variation that highlights the clarinets. Variation C.
Are you ready?
And let us just play the beginning of this variation so that we know what we're talking about. Now, what has this to do with the original theme? Well, I can tell you, all the clarinets are doing is play a triad at the beginning and then play little scales. But they're just much faster and with an accompaniment, which is a certain, like almost a, you know, wooden puppet dance. Can we play this once without the clarinets? Like it's like a bit Stravinsky wooden, clumsy dance. Yeah, so, and that gives this variation a very unique character, but it is very much linked to the actual theme.
There's a lot of playfulness throughout this whole piece, isn't there? It's as if he's having fun, I guess because he is writing it for children, isn't he?
He's writing it for children, and that's why this piece is a real masterpiece, because when you analyze it, it's really complicated and sophisticated, but when you listen to it, it's just fun.
I'm going to see if the musicians agree with that. Rob, I'm coming your way. Let's go and talk to the clarinet. So, Rob, how would you describe this variation?
Well, I think it shows the athleticism of the clarinet as an instrument. We can get around in a very wide range, so it goes very high, very low. And I think, in a way, the skill of this piece, it also reflects the personalities of the kind of people that play these instruments in the orchestra. So clarinetists tend to be sort of laid back, easygoing, and I think this really picks up on that. Good-humoured.
I think the way he uses each instrument to make it sound its best is the key. He never wrote music that would be impossible to play. He would never write something crazy for a trumpet player that was too high or too low, out of range of the instrument. It was always fantastically well written for that instrument, and that was because he had a great skill for writing for orchestra and understanding each particular instrument of the orchestra.
His mastery of instruments was so good that on one occasion, a viola player in the orchestra said, "I don't think this is really possible, Mr. Britten." And Ben picked up the viola and played the passage, which must have been rather mortifying for the player. But you see, everything he did used instruments in a way that took them as far as they could go.
The bassoon is often left to support other instruments. But here in Britten's bassoon variation, it's also given a chance to show off its lyrical range. That's gorgeous, isn't it? Gorgeous. We love that.
Benjamin Britten does this, like, he has a little cosmos here in those 20 bars or something, you know, that's really beautiful.
Jaroslav Augustiniak is the principal bassoonist. It's got a real kind of jazzy swing feel to it. Do you feel that as a player?
Yes, I mean, this is a very specific solo because you have to switch your mood in a split of a second. It is really kind of marchy, very strict rhythm, and suddenly you have to actually enjoy and almost dream and forget about time. And again, come back to the reality. So this requires a little bit spatial attention, I would say. Bassoon is used by Britten fantastic way, I think, because it's like exactly showing this kind of skills of jumping and playing short notes. So basically, like starting from ending at some scale, so going like through this 3 octaves there. So this is kind of interesting because it's exactly about that, just to show the instrument its abilities.
And you think he really got it right?
Yeah, definitely.
What is the character of a bassoonist?
A little bit crazy, I think. Yeah, so yeah, a little bit, you have to be a little bit crazy to carry on with this instrument.
Britten was a composer ready to play with the stuffiness and conventions of classical music. He repeatedly pushed the boundaries of what was possible. working with new mediums like film, television and radio in order to bring orchestral music to a mainstream audience.
What matters to us now is that people want to use our music. For that, as I see it, is our job, to be useful and to the living.
In his early career, he made music for the BBC and for films by the GPO, the General Post Office, including the famous Night Mail, a film documenting the nightly postal train from London to Glasgow. Ending with verse spoken in train-like rhythm, written by the poet W.H. Auden.
Letters of thanks, letters from banks, letters of joy from the girl and the boy, receipted bills and invitations to inspect new stock or to visit relations, and applications for situations and timid lovers, declarations and gossip, gossip from all the nations, news circumstantial, news financial, letters with holiday snaps to enlarge in, letters with faces scrawled in the...
I think he saw it as important in terms of dissemination. You know, take the music to a wider audience. And of course, that fits in with his feeling that music should be useful. So I think from that point of view, he loved it.
Britten worked with television and radio regularly for the rest of his career. In 1966, he helped the BBC to adapt his opera Billy Budd for television, allowing cameras right amongst the characters and into the action. And in 1971, he went one step further, premiering an opera composed specifically for television, Owen Wingrave.
I looked around among all the stories that I could think of immediately for a story which would be most suitable to the medium television.
The composer keeps a watchful eye. Each singer has his own coach, giving him the beat.
I think he's a good example of a composer that has done both and that he has written for broadcast as well as for the concert hall. I think his music was probably very well suited, and he could have written much more for film had he wanted to, because his music was very tuneful and accessible and dramatic, and it would have lent itself very well to film.
Britten was a product of the broadcasting age, embodying the post-war desire to make classical music a right for all, whether rich or poor.
This is not unlike exploring another new instrument. Here is another new way of disseminating music to many people.
That mission had particular resonance when it came to children.
I believe profoundly that children are a very valuable part of musical life. I think, therefore, it is the duty of serious composers, artists of all kinds, to give their best to children, to write music which is usable by them.
Why do you think this piece works so well for young people?
It is a very easy piece to analyze. Every child will immediately understand when you play the flute variation that, oh, this is about the flutes, and this is the color that the flutes play in, the same with all the other instruments, and they will find it very exciting to listen to those different styles of variations, also to watch the players, watch the double basses play those wild scales, and watch all the brass playing this beautiful chorale. The analytical bit is great, but even if you don't bother to analyze, if you just listen, it's just wonderful music.
When I write with a young person in mind, I write exactly the same as when I write for an adult, because young people are very clever and very intuitive, and they understand music and they understand instruments in a way that's very instinctive and natural. So there would be no way that I would ever try and talk down to them.
Don't go drawing back the blind or looking in the streets. Them that ask no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by.
I find them also as audiences highly receptive, very choosy perhaps, but if they like something, and it can be music as new or as old as you like, then their reaction is spontaneous and encouraging.
Britten wrote parts for children into so many of his works, including the operas The Little Sweep and Noah's Flood, both works which rely on children performers and encourage audience participation. He would also capture their attention with the use of unusual instruments.
When I thought of the rain starting at the beginning of the flood, I thought that the good idea of suggesting the first rather ominous raindrops could be done by slinging up a few cups on a bit of string. I also must admit that giving children something like this to do, an instrument which they can make at home, gives them fun and perhaps makes them a little more interested in the music.
I think that he was pointing the way, actually. I mean, he was educating while he was actually scoring, because by using objects that are all around us, we are learning to listen. He recognized that in getting children to make music, to listen to each other and to watch a conductor, he was doing something that was enormously enhancing the cohesiveness of society.
Children and the idea of innocence were such central themes in Britten's work and life.
I think Ben had a real understanding of the way children's minds work, because I think his was so childlike.
The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra is dedicated to the children of the Maud family, Humphrey, Pamela, Caroline and Virginia, for their edification and entertainment. And the tenderness of Britten's cello variation seems to stand as another mark of dedication to Humphrey Maud.
Can we please play the opening of Variation G?
I'm always very touched when we get to the cellos playing that lovely tune, because Britten, having dedicated this to the children of the Maud family, his favourite was clearly Humphrey Maud, who he got on with very well. I'm quite sure this was a gift to Humphrey, who was a cellist. And it's very beautiful and expansive.
Britten's variation also perfectly describes the often plaintive, romantic quality of the cello as an instrument.
And actually what's really interesting is the way he can suddenly produce that tune in the middle of this. So a lot of the other orchestra are being flippant and having fun, like children do, playing games, and then suddenly there's this rather melancholy but wonderful tune.
So this is very bittersweet, isn't it? It's very beautiful, but it's very sad. Maybe this tells us something about Benjamin Britten's psyche, too. It's a bit complicated, very fascinating, very interesting, I think. What comes now is the double bass variation. And you would think, you know, when the cellos have this sad melody, then the double basses, look at those huge instruments, you know, they
Look at their smiley faces, though.
they know what's coming. You know, you would assume that they have something rather heavy, maybe elephant-like, clumsy, which is sometimes done, like, think of the Saint-Saëns Carnival des Animaux. But what Britten does with this double bass variations, he treats the double basses as real virtuoso, fast, rapid instruments playing rapid scales. Can we play, please, the opening of this variation?
I've got to go and talk to Dave Stark. Dave Stark, you've just been described as elephantine, but nothing new. That was extremely fast. Is that unusually fast for a double bass?
It is unusual, yeah. It's usually low and grumbly at the back, but it's it has everything. It's rhythmic, it's melodic, it's quiet, it's loud. Covers all bases, really.
So is this... I was really slow. I was really slow. I'm so sorry. God.
To understand how to write for the orchestra. You've got to be able to almost play a scale on every instrument of the orchestra so you understand it. You've got to understand a flute and a clarinet and a horn and a bassoon and a trumpet and a trombone in order to write for them. So to understand an orchestra as a composer is very, very important, and the Young Person's Guide helps you do that when you're starting out. I love the percussion section where you get all the different elements of the percussion, Chinese gong, tambourine, timps, side drum, you know, they all come together and they have their moment of glory. It's very rare to hear that in a piece of music, that you get the percussion on its own.
So my variation, along with the percussion, is absolutely fantastic. We interlink, which is our job because we work very much as a team. And for the timpani in particular, it's lovely to have a melody rather than just a bass line, because usually the role of the timpani orchestra is we boost the bass line. So it's quite unusual to have such a melodic phrase for us to play.
Because you don't always remember that these have pitches, do you?
Not at all. The range of each of these is so varied. It's wonderful.
Can you show us?
Of course.
So you say you're sharing the job, if you like, in this variation with you and your colleagues in the percussion section, but how much is on you?
Well, I'm really there to keep the pulse going, to shape the melody as it comes in.
So what are the particular challenges of this variation for you?
It's a strange variation, and he's quite sort of, I think, quite sort of comedic about this one, because most of the time our job is to be the timekeepers. As Christina was speaking about, you know, keeping the pulse going. She sets up the pulse. Every one of our little duets seems to feel like the pulse has got slightly out of gear. So we seem to break up the pulse that she set up, and conductors actually find this variation quite hard to conduct, because they lose track of where the beat is.
That actually sounds a bit of a nightmare.
It is, and that's why this collection of excerpts all turn up in auditions.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
So if you can do this bluntly, you can pretty much do anything.
It's fairly standard on any of the instruments that you'll expect this to be in the excerpt list.
So what's the trick then? If the conductor might be losing the plot slightly and you've got all this sort of, you know, counterintuitive rhythm and stuff going on, how do you keep it together?
Well, you kind of work as a little team, and you know full well that if you stick to what you know it sounds like, you'll come out in the right place. Because what happens is that you start like you're in time, and then slightly then it feels like it's come out of time, and then the end of it comes back into time, which is a really strange thing. But if you think of the timp part that you've heard, when you've got ba-ba-da-bum, bum, bim, ba-ba-da-bum, bum, bum, there's a very strong pulse in there.
Yeah.
But if I play you this little bit of snare drum...
So I'm thinking of that pulse.
Yeah, so I'll give you the lead in, and then I'll sing the string part as well, and then what I play in between.
Okay, nice.
So you get ba-ba-da-bum, bum, bim, ba-ba-da-bum, bum, bum, bibbidi-bap, 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 bibbidi-bap. So all the way through there, you suddenly think, where on earth has the beat gone?
So why was Britten doing this?
I think it's a bit of humour from him to sort of say, you know, you're expecting the percussionists just to play in time, and I think he's just having a bit of fun here. It's quite fun from a player's point of view to watch conductors struggle with this, because they do. They generally come out of it a little bit behind where they should be.
It does seem that this was such a wonderful opportunity for the percussion section to really shine in this piece. Did that change the role of the percussionist thereafter?
I think certainly at this time, percussion was expanding quite dramatically. And Britten was really at the forefront of that. You know, if you look through many of his works, he is always challenging. There's new instruments coming in, there's new sound colours that he's trying to develop. And he did an awful lot of that work with the percussionist he got on very well with at the time, called James Blades.
Get the triplet on the beat. That's important.
Jimmy Blades and Ben simply created noises. When they wanted something where an instrument didn't exist, they went out and invented it.
The next thing was the multiple whip. This was to give the impression of the crackling of the flames. Here it is. Slats of wood. I must say that I was probably thrown out of at least half a dozen wood shops in London. They all thought I was crazy, looking around for pieces of wood and slapping them together to see if there was any difference in pitch.
You see, that's a brilliant idea to conjure up flames. I must admit, I'd never have thought about it.
You never know what to expect from Mr. Britten.
To end the piece in virtuosic fashion, Britten draws the orchestra together again. Each instrument joins in turn, playing interwoven melodies in an increasingly exhilarating wave of music, showcasing the excitement of a symphonic orchestra in full flight. The fugue.
It's like a time lapse, a speeded up version of all the variations that we had. A fugue is for a composer the most difficult thing to write. There's one theme that forms the whole thing, and there's many different voices, in this case. Flutes, then oboes, then clarinets, and so it goes through the whole orchestra. Everyone plays the same theme, everyone enters at a different time. So you would think, oh my God, this must sound like complete chaos, cacophony. But it's not the case. If the composer is great as Britten, he manages to write it in a way that it sounds light and delightful and transparent. So there is a theme for the fugue, which is introduced by the piccolo flute.
Nice. But don't you think this is sort of the musical equivalent of this is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? You know, you've had all the beautiful sections and the variations, but then this comes together and it's just even better than all of that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like a coronation of the piece, like a culmination. It's like, I almost have a feeling it's like a little competition. Every instrument wants to show who is better, coming in with the theme. And so there's not only one theme, there's even a second theme that is happening later.
Which sounds familiar.
It's the beginning, it's the opening of the theme we had with the triad and the scale. That's all we have. So you see how this is all somehow linked, but you don't hear it. It just sounds like fun.
So it builds up an idea that we know. The skill is to make it not sound academic. I can't tell you how many academic fugues I've heard in my life, and I don't ever want to hear any more.
The complex fugue can prove particularly demanding for some instruments.
The tempo is a challenge. If the conductor takes it a bit fast, then you just fall off on the harp.
Moritz, did you hear that? Don't take it too fast, she's saying. Okay.
I mean, I admire Britten greatly. I think his work is fantastic and he knows how to write for each instrument. There's one thing between knowing how to write for an instrument and knowing how to write comfortably for an instrument. And I think it's not very comfortable. It's possible,
but he wasn't being kind.
It's not comfortable. He wasn't being kind.
No. It has this amazing climax at the end, which is the real Hollywood finish, isn't it? It feels like John Williams heard it as a 13-year-old and then wrote Star Wars straight away, you know? It's a fabulous way to finish a piece of music which is meant to appeal to young people.
It's like the Purcell, the 17th century rondo, now in a grand romantic version with a big romantic orchestra with all the brass and percussion instruments that Purcell didn't have, and happening at the same time as the fugue theme. The complicated thing is that the fugue theme we hear is very fast, and it's in a valse like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Whereas the opening theme is very slow, it's very broad and grand, and it goes in a 1, 2, 1, 2. This is actually a bit which is tricky for the conductor, and I think also for the orchestra, because what you hear might
might lead you on the wrong path. You have to be very strict and just count, count, count in order to be together. Would you like to hear this once?
I think we should.
So, this is going to be in the fugue, 5 bars before the 3/4, please.
Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra is a victim of its own success. It's very, very sophisticated writing, and I would go so far as to say it is one of his finest pieces.
It shows the most extraordinary skill in its creation, because he wrote out that fugue without kind of lots of sketches, almost straight into score. And that is an incredible achievement. He's laid out all the pieces on the floor. Just think of a jigsaw puzzle this big. How do you put it all together? And suddenly there it is. And it's just grandiose.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Benjamin Britten's The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, played by the BBC National Orchestra of Wales.
Thank you.